Today's lesson is violent video games. Harmless fun or gateways to violence? Hi, everybody. I'm Roger.
And I'm Mike. Can you have a peaceful young teenager, but after being exposed to too many violent video games over too many years, does this peaceful young teenager become an angry young teenager? People have been talking about this for a long time. And in fact, Roger, I was thinking that even before video games, they were talking about action movies. Remember parents being afraid that if their kids watched a Superman movie, they would try to jump off the house thinking that they could fly. Now,
I remember that, yeah.
Blaming things like that on media and entertainment that kids consume has been around for a long time, but it must be said that the Superman films of the 50s and 60s were nowhere near as violent as many of the video games that kids are playing these days.
Right, and of course, last time we heard some testimonials from some people. Liam said that, no, the games should not be banned. They're harmless. I've played them. I can tell fantasy from reality. And then Sarah, who's 42 years old, she's concerned about her teenagers. She does not want them to watch these video games or play these video games so that they might think, hey, all we need to do to solve our problems is to shoot, and kill. And then Jordan, of course, thought that, hey, I grew up playing them. I'm perfectly fine. I just played them to let off steam. And then as a result, I wasn't so aggressive. Now, today we're going to hear some more testimonies from some different people. We've got Emma and Mia in the first part of our lesson for today. Let's listen.
Emma, 61. No way. I'm a teacher, and over the years, I've noticed the kids in my class have become substantially more aggressive. I'm sure that change ultimately comes down to the growing popularity of this type of video game. Mia, 16. I don't personally like them. They scare me. But I think they're fun if you like that kind of thing, and your parents educate you about them. My little brother does, and my dad has spoken to him about them. He knows there's nothing fun about real-life violence.
大家好，第一部分首先介绍片语 come down to 名词，意思是归结为某个原因，或是归根究底在于……例如 Brian's illness comes down to overworking and depression. Brian 的病归结于过度劳累和忧郁。又或者说 The key to success comes down to a lot of hard work and a little luck. 成功的关键取决于多加努力和一点运气。
All right, we are back. So we have, 5 more opinions today on this question of whether violent video games are an appropriate form of entertainment for teenagers. In day 1, we had kind of 2 yeses to that question. Of course, Liam and Jordan both thought that they were okay as a form of entertainment for young people. But one person, Sarah, the grown-up, the parent, said, no, none of those games for my kids. I don't want them being influenced and becoming violent. Let's see who's next. We have Emma here. Emma is probably not your typical gamer. I'm saying that because she's 61 years old, so maybe a little old for the video game generation. And what's her opinion? She says, very strongly, no way. They are not appropriate at all. When you say no way, that's a very strong no. Do you want to go skydiving with me this weekend? No way. I'm afraid of heights. She says, no way, not appropriate at all. I'm a teacher, she says, and over the years I've noticed the kids in my class have become substantially more aggressive. Interesting. So also kind of being a parent, being in charge of kids and being responsible for raising good kids as a teenager, she has a much longer view of this. She's been a teacher for many years, maybe, 35, 40 years, something like that. So over the long view, she says, or over the years, I've noticed the kids in my class have become substantially more aggressive. So the kids in the 60s and 70s weren't as aggressive, she's saying, as the kids today. There's been a substantial change. Substantial is more than a little. It's a lot. It's enough to be noticed, enough to be important, enough to be taken seriously. If there's going to be a substantial amount of rain today, then you'll definitely want to rethink your plans for a picnic. If it's just a minor amount or a small amount, then it's enough to ignore. But if it's substantial, you can't really ignore it. So kids are basically simply a lot more violent or aggressive, she says, these days than in days before. I'm sure, she says, that change ultimately comes down to the growing popularity of this type of video games. So she is definitely blaming the video games, isn't she, Roger?
She certainly is. So ultimately here just means in the end, after you've considered everything, then finally you come to this conclusion. She says that change ultimately comes down to the growing popularity of this type of video game. So it comes down to this. That's the final explanation. You could say, for example, when it comes down to it, it's every man for himself. At the end of all discussions about society, basically everybody is selfish and only cares about themselves. When it comes down to it, when we get to the basic facts, that's what's happening here. So her conclusion is that change ultimately comes down to the growing popularity of this type of video game. And, of course, that will change how people view video games, and maybe she supports a ban on them as well.
Absolutely. But she could also be getting confused between correlation and causation. Just because there's a relationship between two things, more video games and more aggressive students, doesn't mean that one results from the other. It could just be a coincidence. Maybe the kids are becoming more aggressive for other reasons, problems at home with their family, dietary issues, the music they listen to, the films they watch. It doesn't always mean that it's the video games. But let's look at Mia next. Mia is 16, so again, a teenager. Girls generally do play fewer games and certainly fewer violent games. So let's look at Mia's point of view. I don't personally like them. They scare me. Okay, well, there you go. One good reason to not play them at all. You just don't enjoy them in the same way that some people just really don't enjoy watching horror movies. Some people really don't enjoy playing violent video games. But, she says, I think they're fine if you like that kind of thing and your parents educate you about them. So Mia is coming out strongly here in support of parental supervision. If parents know what the kids are playing and can kind of monitor it, maybe even talk to the kids, she thinks that some of these games won't necessarily be that bad if the parents are involved with the children, their games, and their lives.
Right, so she doesn't play these games herself, but she thinks that they're okay for people as long as they're educated by their parents. And she goes on to say, my little brother does. He plays them, he likes them, and my dad has spoken to him about them. So yes, Mia's father spoke to her little brother and told him all about video games and what he needs to know. So therefore, Mia's little brother will probably be okay after playing violent video games. And then Mia goes on to say, he knows there's nothing fun about real-life violence. So yes, indeed, we see the violence on the video games, but we have to know for sure that, hey, life in the real world will present violence in a different form. You'll actually get killed. In video games, of course, if you get killed, you get another life. You can start all over again. But in the real world, if you get killed, that's it. You're done. You're a goner. All right, let's move on now to the second part of our lesson. We've got a couple of more testimonials here. We've got Carlos and we've got Grace. Let's find out what they think about this question.
Carlos, 30.
If we let kids watch violent movies and violence on the news, then I don't see why violent video games should be off limits. The world has violence in it, so these games help prepare teenagers for reality.
Grace, 45. The academic research on this topic is often contradictory. Some studies find links between these games and increased violence in teens. Others do not. Personally, I think it's up to the parents. They know their kids. If they see any changes in behavior, they can limit the games. I don't think it's an all-or-nothing issue.
第二部分我们来看到 off limits， 它是形容词，意思是禁止使用的或是禁止进入的。例如 Some chemicals in the laboratory are off limits for use by students. 实验室里的一些化学药品是禁止学生使用的。或是 The army base is off limits to civilians. 这座军事基地禁止平民进入。接着一样介绍形容词 contradictory， 它是相互矛盾的、对立的或是不一致的意思。例如 The two people who saw the accident have contradictory stories about it. 目睹这起事故的两个人拥有相互矛盾的说法，或者 The statements made by the politician were contradictory, and a reporter questioned him about them. 这位政治人物自相矛盾的言论遭到一名记者追问。再来是 something be up to somebody 这个片语，表示点点点由某人来决定。举例来说 It is up to Kevin's boss whether he will have to work over the holiday. Kevin 放假期间是否必须工作，要看他老板的意思。或是 It's up to the board to decide who the new CEO is. 谁是新任执行长，要由董事会决定。除此之外 somebody be up to 加名词或是动词 ing 也指有能力做点点点，胜任点点点或是偷偷进行的意思。例如 Jack suspects his boss is up to shady business. Jack 怀疑他的老板在进行什么见不得人的事情。也可以说 Shelley is the only person who is up to doing all this work. Shelley 是能胜任这全部工作的唯一人选。下一个是名词 behavior， 它指的是行为或是举止。比如说 Beth's good behavior in prison got her released 7 months early. Beth 在牢中的良好表现让她提早7个月获释。或是 Judging from its behavior, the cat is probably hungry. 从这只猫的行为来判断，它很可能是饿了。
All right, we move on to Carlos. Carlos, it says, is 30 years old. He says, if we let kids watch violent movies and violence on the news, then I don't see why violent video games should be off limits. Interesting point of view. I've definitely heard this before. It's a violent world we live in. I mean, some people have estimated that by the time they're 18, most kids will have seen like 10,000 murders on television and police shows and movies, war films, all sorts of things like that. We don't worry too much about that these days. And violence on the news, yes. I mean, they do blur out certain things and edit certain things, but if you're looking for raw footage of wars or something, you don't have to go much further than YouTube to find that. And of course, most of that is very accessible to anyone with a television or an internet connection. So he's saying, then I don't see why violent video games should be off limits. If we let kids watch war movies and the news, then why can't they play war video games? Why should those games be off limits? If something is off limits, it's basically something you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed access to an area that's off limits. They might put a rope in front of it or a sign that says do not enter. And of course, for kids would know that for them, liquor stores, bars, places like that are off limits. They're not allowed to go in those places or to do those activities. The world has violence in it, so these games help prepare teenagers for reality. Well, I'm not sure about that, but no, it's true. The world has violence in it. So he's kind of thinking that, if kids are going to go out into this mean old world and just be sort of innocents walking around with their eyes wide open, shocked by what they see, then they need a bit of an education, and maybe violent video games provide that. That's an interesting point of view.
Right. It's kind of educational, according to Carlos, to let people know that the world is violent, and violent video games kind of teach people about that without letting people get killed or hurt. Now, here's Grace's opinion. She's 45 years old, and she says, the academic research on this topic is often contradictory. So maybe she doesn't really know how to answer this question. She has to think about it. Let me see. And she talks about something called the academic research on this topic. If something's academic, it has to do with education or colleges, universities. So she's talking about research that is conducted by universities, laboratories, or whatever. And she says it's often contradictory, which means sometimes it says one thing and then sometimes it says another thing, and those things seem to be the opposite of each other. They're contradictory.
That's a good point. Some studies find links between these games and increased violence in teens. Others do not. So there you go. Just as Roger explained, when they do these research studies every few years in different parts of the world by different people using different methods, they come up with different data, different results. So it's not a big surprise, I guess, because we're talking about human behavior, culture gets involved, different generations get involved, and it can definitely change. So some of those studies find a link. Yes, violent video games leads to more violent acts in real life. Other studies find exactly the opposite. No, there's no relationship here. It's as likely that the kids will be violent because they eat more potato chips or something like that. There's no link between these things. She says, personally, I think it's up to the parents. Again, coming down on the side of good parenting and parental responsibility, it's up to the parents. If something is up to someone, it is their responsibility. It is their decision to make. The buck ultimately stops with them. So it's up to the parents. If they just park their kids in front of the TV and let them play whatever they want without caring, the kids might get into the bad stuff. But if the parents are engaged and responsible, then they will be able to monitor their kids and deal with issues, deal with problems or things that they see. They know their kids, Grace says. If they see any changes in behavior, they can limit the game. So there you go. They all live in the same home. If the parents take the time to get engaged with their kids' lives, they will be able to see any changes in behavior. And if that happens, they can limit, they can ban, they can make those games off limits for the kids. Especially, yes, if the behavior of your lovely child suddenly becomes very aggressive and angry and violent, parents would notice this. Behavior is basically how you act, your mood, the things that you do, the things that you say. So if the kids are normally nice and peaceful and always getting along with their brothers and sisters, and then all of a sudden, over just a few months, it seems they're a new person, they're getting in fights, they're getting in trouble, they're hitting kids when they have problems and frustration, that is definitely changed behavior, a changed way of doing things in the world and how they react to people and problems they face. I don't think it's an all or nothing issue. So it's it could be a little bit bad for some kids. It could be a major problem. For other kids, it's not a problem. Everyone is different. It's not an all or nothing issue. It's not a black or white issue. There's a lot of gray here.
Okay, let's move on now to the third part of our lesson and find out what Ryan has to say.
Ryan, 36. Maybe not the ones with super realistic violence. I can see how they could set a bad example for some young people. But there are lots of games where the violence is really cartoonish. Those types are fine, I think, as they're so obviously fantasy.
《最后第三部分来看到 realistic 这个形容词的意思是逼真的、写实的或是现实的、务实的。我们可以说 Valerie's drawing is so realistic that I thought it was a photograph. Valerie 的画非常写实，以至于我以为那是一张照片。最后一个例子 The television drama was praised for its realistic portrayal of the lives of police officers. 这出电视剧真实描绘了警察的生活而受到赞赏。
Okay, everybody, as promised, we're going to talk about what Ryan has to say about this question. He says, maybe not the ones with super realistic violence. Okay, remember the question was, are violent video games an appropriate form of entertainment for teenagers? And again, this is Ryan's opinion. Well, maybe not the ones with super realistic violence, okay? So maybe he thinks that those ones are a little problematic if they have super realistic violence, the kind of violence that we might expect to see in the real world. Of course, a lot of times in those video games, the violence is kind of fakey, as we say. It's not really realistic. You know, it's just a fantasy land. But if the games are really realistic, if they are super realistic, then that might be a problem, according to Ryan. Something's realistic when it looks real. Like that painting there is so realistic, it looks like a photograph.
So he thinks if you're shooting, cartoon characters or zombies or Pac-Man eating a ghost, that's not realistic. That looks like a cartoon, looks like something you'd see in a film, not the real world. But he says, I can see how they could set a bad example for some young people, the realistic ones, because some of those games can become very realistic with, blood and heads exploding and things like that. And, if young people see that, they might think that it's sort of normal. It might not bother them or shock them in a way. And some of them, unfortunately, might even think it's cool or something like that. It could set a bad example for some young people. If they're playing those games and getting a little bit too into them, then maybe they're looking at these games as an example, as a way to behave, as sort of modeling behavior. But this is a bad example for some people. It's not okay to think that this stuff is cool or right or normal in any way. But he's kind of saying there's not that many games like that. Many of their games are the more cartoonish ones. He says, but there are a lot of games where the violence is really cartoonish, like you would see in a cartoon. So cartoonish violence, cartoonish behavior, if you're sort of making wild noises and making your face look really funny like a clown, that could be sort of cartoonish behavior. So in those kinds of games, clearly it's not the real world. It's very candy-colored. The violence is very sort of silly and not serious. He thinks that that's probably okay. Those types are fine, I think, as they're so obviously fantasy. No one would ever confuse a candy-colored cartoon video game where you're using a gun that shoots out hearts or something to kill monsters. Those types of things are clearly not real. They're obviously fantasy. So he thinks, in that case, they're probably okay.
That brings us to the end of our discussion. Let's listen now to Hanny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第二部分 G 选项是45岁的 Grace 所提出的看法。他说，关于这个主题的学术研究常常相互矛盾。那他用到 contradictory 这个形容词来表达相互矛盾的或是对立的、不一致的。那么它的动词是 contradict。那我们来学它的字首字根。好，看到 counter counter， 或者是看到 contra， 那这两个字首同源，就带有相反的、与什么相对的或是对应的等等的语义。那在 contradict 这个字当中，它的字首 contra 就表示 against 反对。那么字根 dict 它表示 say speak 也就是说的意思。那合在一起 contradict 就是表达反驳，与什么抵触，互相矛盾。我们补充两个有这一类字根的单字。第一个是 counteract，它的字首 counter 有相反对立的意思，那么 act 表示行动作用，对立的行动应该可以联想到 counteract， 它有抵消或是对抗的意思。那第二个补充的是 counterattack， 它的字首 counter 是指相反对立， attack 是攻击，那所以合在一起 counterattack 就表示反攻反击。我们继续看到课文里 Grace 说的下一句，她说，有些研究发现这些游戏与青少年暴力行为增加之间存在关联，其他研究则不然。那它是用 some studies ... others ... 来表达说有些研究怎么样，其他研究怎么样。我们这边要介绍的就是 some ... others ... 它可以表达有些怎么样，有些怎么样。那这个用法是在没有限定范围的人事物里面列举出两种群体的状况，而 some 和 other 也可以当形容词，我们就可以用 some 名词... other 名词... 这样的句型表达。只是为了避免重复名词，other 名词这个部分呢，常常也会用代名词 others 来取代，就像课文的用法。好，我们看个例句 Some people like summer, others prefer winter. 有些人喜欢夏天，有些人比较喜欢冬天。这时候句子里面用到代名词 others， 就是用来代替 other people， 以避免重复。好，那补充一下，如果要在没限定范围的人数里面列举出三个群体，这时候会用 some ... others ... still others ... 好，那另外还要特别注意的是，如果你就只有这两种类别了， 就是你举完一个群体，剩下就是另外一个群体，没有别的类别。那这时候我们要加上定冠词咯，所以就会写作 some the others 来表达有些怎么样，其他怎么样。例如 Some of the books are in Chinese, the others are in English. 有些书是中文的，那其他的是英文的。好，以上是今天重点整理，我们来回顾今天单字吧。
Substantially. Walter has improved his cooking skills substantially by watching online cooking demonstrations. Ultimately. A good diet and exercise are ultimately the main factors in staying healthy. Academic. Rebecca's academic achievements should help her earn a scholarship to attend university. Contradictory. Her statements were contradictory. She said one thing yesterday and the opposite today. Behavior. His polite and respectful behavior sets a positive example for his classmates. Realistic. Because the painting was very realistic, some people even mistook it for a photograph.
Discussion starter starts now!
Here's our discussion starter for today. The question is, do you think violent video games are an appropriate form of entertainment for teenagers? Why or why not?
Seeing as violent video games are played around the world by millions and millions of people, I think they're a completely acceptable form of entertainment for teens. It really does come down to parents knowing their kids, knowing what the kids are playing, and addressing any behavior issues before they become a problem. Good parenting, I think, is the solution.
Good idea. Well, I don't think teenagers should be allowed to play violent video games, or at least they should be discouraged from playing those kinds of games, considering that there are all sorts of other things that they could do. If you play video games, whether they're violent or not, you're just sitting there staring at a blank screen for hours and hours. You need to get off your butt and go outside and play some basketball, play some baseball, go running, ride your bicycle. Those are much more fulfilling activities.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Mike.
I am Roger. See you next time.